All right, so just a quick video today, kind of wrapping up our unit on these functions, these nth root functions, rational exponent functions. We've been finding inverses in this last video. So we're just kind of wrapping up the unit today with something called the horizontal line test. So basically, if I give you the graph of a function, you're able to tell me if that graph is a function because we have a test called the vertical line test, right? So if I said, okay, is f of x a function? And these examples should look familiar. These are the two graphs where we found the inverse graphs from our last video. So if I said, is f of x a function, you would look at your function f of x and you would pass a vertical line through your graph, right? And you would say, okay, well, yeah, it passes the vertical line test. So my first graph is a function. And in my second graph, okay, if I also use the vertical line test, yeah, that also passes the vertical line test. All right, so both of these original f of x graphs were functions. So what if I said, okay, well, is the inverse a function? Well, what you would have to do is kind of what we did in that first video. Take points from your original graph, flip the x and y's, regraph your new function, and then perform that vertical line test again. So if I look at the new graph of the inverse of my original function, and if I do the vertical line test there, okay, that passes the vertical line test. So in our first case, the original graph and its inverse were both functions. All right, in my second graph, I took my points, I flipped the x and y values, and I regraphed it. Remember, we had a parabola, but we ended up with a parabola on its side for its inverse. Okay, well, let's say I flip your points, regraph everything, do the vertical line test again, and this time you can see that this graph does not pass the vertical line test. All right, so in this case, my original graph was a function, but my inverse was not a function. Okay. In my first example, my original graph was a function, but the inverse was also a function. In the second one, it was a function, but its inverse was not. So, this is kind of a lot of work. I don't really want to take points, flip my x and y values, replot them, just to do the vertical line test again. Instead, I don't even need to graph the the inverse function. I can just determine if its inverse is a function by looking at the original graph and using what's called the horizontal line test. All right, so the horizontal line test says if a horizontal line passes through the graph of f of x more than once, then its inverse, f inverse of x, is not a function, right? Because when you end up graphing an inverse, the graph just flips, right? It's reflected about that line y equals x. It pretty much like flips on its side. So instead of regraphing everything, just flip the vertical line to use a horizontal line to do the test, right? So here's two quick examples. Let's say I give you the graph. Here's the graph f of x, and I wanted to know, is the inverse a function? So if I want to know if the inverse is a function, I'm not going to regraph it. I'm going to use the horizontal line test, and I can see that right here the horizontal line crosses through 1, 2, 3 times. It crosses through more than once. So if I said, is this inverse a function? Well, the answer is no. F of x is not, or sorry, f inverse of x is not a function because the graph of f of x failed the horizontal line test. And I'm going to abbreviate that with just HLT, okay? So by looking at the graph of f of x, if I did the horizontal line test, I can immediately tell that its inverse is not a function because it failed the horizontal line test. All right, so if you look at this second example, okay, here's my graph of f of x. I want to know, is its inverse a function? Okay, well, if I test the horizontal line through this graph, I don't see any issues. Every horizontal line passes through exactly once. So I would say f inverse of x is a function because the graph of f of x passed the horizontal line test. So I'm just going to abbreviate there, okay? All right, so if I give you a graph of f of x and I say, is its function an inverse, just use the horizontal line test to determine that. Okay, so if I go back to those original two problems, right, if I covered up the graph of the inverse and I said, okay, does this pass the horizontal line test? Okay, if you pass horizontal lines through this graph, it would pass the horizontal line test. So its inverse would be a function. Here, if you passed horizontal lines through this original function, you could see it would pass more than once, which means it would fail, which means its inverse would not be a function. Okay, so the horizontal line test is kind of just like a shortcut for determining if a function's inverse is also a function. So the the Schoology practice you guys are going to do right now uses some of these topics about horizontal line tests and also topics that we covered in the last video. So you want both notes out from this video and the previous one to kind of wrap up this unit on inverse functions and horizontal line test.